Welcome back to our discussion on constitutional amendments. Well, Dr. Villegas, again, I'd like to ask, so you were talking about debates, discussions. What were the more, shall we say, emotional areas that you were discussing with your fellow Constitutional Commission members at that time?
Well, the first I can cite had to do with protecting the baby from conception.
So, nung araw pa pala, it was already a...
yeah, that was highly debated, no? And then another one was presidential, but what type? Unicameral or bicameral? So we never discussed parliamentary versus presidential. It was assumed we would go to presidential. Why? Because the Marcos constitution was parliamentary.
So if it's Marcos, it must be bad.
Exactly. But this thing about presidential, unicameral or bicameral took a lot of time. And I must say, people blame me for its being bicameral. But not because I was the most influential person, but because my name is Villegas. And so I voted last.
Yeah.
And I broke the tie.
You were the tiebreaker.
Yeah, yeah.
But going back to the conception begins at life thing, obviously you're talking about abortion. And I think more or less the concept of abortion right now generally is not an accepted feature in our society, particularly when you talk about that in relation to contraception. But apparently from what you've just said, abortion was a controversial issue, meaning that there was a huge lobby for abortion at that time?
Well, without focusing on individuals precisely, we had too many leftists in terms of the proportion.
But why would the leftists be so interested in abortion? I mean, what does that have to do with their political agenda?
The leftists always want to go against anything that establishes religion, and the leftists usually are anti-Christian. So anything that has to do with Christian principles. For example, the leftists in Europe, I lived in Spain. Socialism in Spain, fortunately it has ended, had nothing to do with the economy anymore. Some of the socialists are more market-oriented and capitalist. The leftists in Spain want to completely destroy Christian principles. Abortion, same-sex marriage, you know, instant divorce. So anything that can completely destroy the faith, they introduce.
In Article 2, you were essentially able to, well, I think you could be credited for inserting the phrase that the protection of the child at conception.
Yes.
Are you particularly happy with that phrase? Or looking back, do you think you could have revised that phrase more? I think the issue right now is actually the definition of conception.
Yes.
So,
well, my original wording was from the moment of conception, to really make sure that we talk about in terms of
what happened then? Why was the...
some of those who wanted to give some flexibility said from conception, and then we debated when conception begins, and there were some of these people who were saying, oh, we don't know, etc., etc. But I kept on emphasizing together with people like Cecilia Palma that it should be from the very beginning of the fertilization of the egg.
Would you remember how was the vote done with regard to that particular phrase?
Oh yes.
Was it a close vote?
No, majority voted in favor of saying from conception.
Okay, and that's an interesting thing. I mean, people make much about the fact that the Hungarian constitution recently, I think just last June, included the pro-life provision in its in their constitution, and people were essentially making a big thing about it. But I think one of the things we could say is that since 1987, we've actually had that pro-life provision already, and the Philippines was among the first to do that. Elmer, just to ask again, so what are the main differences between the 87 and the 1973 and 35 constitutions? Just so that the viewers could look at
to simplify, basically, the 1973 Constitution was an autocratic-run presidential system. Marcos at that time, the president at that time, was exercising both legislative and executive powers. But compared to the 1987, the 1987 Constitution provided for separation of powers among the three branches of government.
But the 35 was like that. So why didn't we just revert to the 35? The 1935 Constitution. What was the reason for that? I mean, if the argument was that the 1973 Constitution was essentially written by Marcos and perhaps not valid, then why wasn't a reversion made back to the 35 instead? Anybody?
May I answer that?
Yes.
Precisely 35, according to the leftists again, was too U.S. influenced. And so, for example, this very statement, which is a basic principle, which I think should not be in the Constitution, that the Philippine economy should be controlled by Filipinos. That was not definitely in the 1935 Constitution.
In fact, I think but would you say, or would you agree that it actually went to the other extreme, that it actually provided too much rights for the Americans as far as the 1935 Constitution is concerned? Or is it a myth made by revisionist historians, would you say, especially the parity rights?
1935 definitely gave a lot of freedom to the Americans. Yes, and that's what the 1987 Constitution wanted to remedy.
Okay. So, well, as the discussion is going, I mean, apparently there are certain provisions that should not be in a fundamental document, and hence the certain calls for the amendments to the Constitution. How would an amendment to a Constitution be actually made? What would be the process that one would need?
But first, let us distinguish between amendment and a revision. An amendment simply involves a piecemeal change of certain provisions of the Constitution. But if we will talk of revision, that will require the total overhauling, revamp of the entire Constitution itself. But whether it is an amendment or revision, there are two steps that must be taken. First, proposal, and then the second one is ratification.
So is it possible for an amendment to the Constitution be made wherein the people in general would not know about it? I mean, we know of instances, and we've read about it in newspapers, of Congress railroading certain things, certain issues, which we need not discuss. But is it possible to actually even railroad a constitutional amendment?
Under the present Constitution, there are three ways of making proposals to our Constitution. First, through a direct action by Congress, through a 3/4 vote of all of its members. The second one is by through a constitutional convention, and the third one is through a people's initiative.
So would it be possible?
Yes, I think that will be possible.
Assuming that the numbers are there.
Because Congress, by 3/4 vote of all of its members, can make proposals to our present Constitution.
Now, the question is, what if, for example, on the assumption that Congress makes an amendment, and that amendment, for some reason, is questionable? Would a person have the right, for example, of filing a case in the Supreme Court? Or to put it another way, would the Supreme Court have the authority to overturn a constitutional amendment?
I believe that if that proposal of Congress will pass through a vote of 3/4 of all of its members, then any question on the wisdom of that proposal will now become a political question, which may not be questioned before our courts.
True. If perhaps the Supreme Court could question it, perhaps the question could be on the process of the amendment, not on the actual provisions of the amendment itself. But then that leaves us again with the question, for certain people, mine included, and perhaps I'm sure you as well, Dr. Villegas, that what if, for example, the constitutional amendment is not in conformity with natural law? Then would the Supreme Court have the authorization, for example, to overturn such an amendment precisely because it does not conform to natural law? Anybody?
Well, if there's an amendment, let's assume that the amendment says there will be no freedom of speech.
Yeah, of course we know that the question I asked is purely theoretical.
No freedom of speech, no. So they will remove that. So that's against natural law. But assuming the 3/4 of Congress would say we are in favor of that amendment, definitely some people's initiative will still have to come and say we object to that and let's bring it.
Meaning that the people themselves would take an initiative to overturn whatever amendments there is.
Remind me, if 3/4 of Congress propose an amendment, are they not required to go to a referendum?
Yes, that will still be subject to ratification.
So that's where the people initiative will
So to sneak it in, it's not as a possibility.
No.
Okay. Again, quite interesting, but we'll have to take a break. we'll finish it off with certain controversial topics that perhaps people have been raising for the past several years with regard to the Constitution. And I'm talking here about economic nationalism, contraception, the issues of same-sex marriage and divorce. Hope you can join us still. Thank you.